News First, Newsline.
Hello there, very good evening. Welcome to another edition of Newsline. We're coming to you live and direct from our News First studios here in Colombo. The past few years have taught Sri Lankans a lot of bitter lessons, and one of the most bitter lessons that Sri Lanka learned was from the failed agricultural policy. Farmers were affected by it, people, consumers were affected by it, and at the end we learned that coordination, communication, making the right decisions at the right time really makes a world of change. Today we find ourselves not having learned from those mistakes, as farmers who didn't have fertilizer back in the day now don't have water. Why did this really happen in Sri Lanka? Was the situation in the country so unpredictable that those in power, the relevant authorities who are specialists in this subject, didn't see this coming? To discuss these matters and much more, we've got with us here today Professor Buddhi Marambe, Senior Professor from the University of Peradeniya. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for bringing me in.
Professor, first questions first. The people know the situation in the country where there's a lack of water for farmers. Besides that, of course, farmers who did harvest their crop are also having issues of selling their crop, but we'll get into that issue later. Professor, firstly, the lack of water in Sri Lanka, especially during this time, was it predicted that this sort of a situation would arise in Sri Lanka? Did the Met Department have the information required to inform the relevant stakeholders that there is going to be an intensified dry season in Sri Lanka, so let's start preserving water?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question that you ask, and it's a prevailing situation that we have to find solution and not to make any mistakes again for the future. Let me put it this way. If you take Sri Lanka, in the normal climate, there are 4 rainfall seasons. The first one is called the first intermonsoon, which is kind of a convection type rains that comes in March to April.
Right.
And then we have the southwest monsoon coming from May to end September, gradually drying out. Actually, we are in that latter part of that southwest monsoon right now.
Right.
So the first intermonsoon plus the southwest monsoon makes up the yellow season. That's what we call it, right? And after this yellow season, what comes next is called the second intermonsoon. That is from October to November, followed by the northeast monsoon. That is from December to February. So you can see basically a full calendar year is in. But that doesn't mean Sri Lanka gets rainfall from all those seasons across borders. No. We have to understand there's our highland side, the center. That's why we call them central highlands. Because of that, when the eastern slope is wet, the western slope is dry, and vice versa. Because you know, when the southwest monsoon comes in, it originates from Madagascar, and it goes across the western province and hit the central mountains. So you find definitely the drier parts in the eastern province and so on. Just an example. But you know, normally, once again, we all have to remember, because dry zone is the heart of our agriculture.
Right.
Normal scenario, July, August, September are dry periods. But this year, the intensity of this dryness was higher due to various reasons. We know about climate change, and people say it's proven beyond any reasonable doubt that the human interventions, because of the Industrial Revolution, has contributed a lot by emitting greenhouse gases, which we have spoken quite some time back as well. And that has created a lot of significant changes in the climate, especially the global warming as we experience it. Now, there's another natural phenomenon that takes place, which is called El Nino and La Nina, for example. Now, this El Nino and La Nina phenomenon take place in the central and the eastern parts of the Pacific Ocean, and it takes place closer to the equator.
Right.
What really happens in this phenomenon is that when you say El Nino, in simple terms, the sea surface temperature goes beyond the normal temperature.
Right.
So there's a warm condition that created. And that impacts, though it originates at the Pacific Ocean, it impacts the whole world because it's all are connected.
Because there's a wave of heat that sweeps across the world. Right.
So when you look at the overall phenomenon, the organizations or agencies in the global scenario that monitor these conditions, usually a El Nino scenario will comes up once in 3 to 7 years, for example. The previous experience that we had was the El Nino that started in 2015. Some people say there was an impact in 2014 also, but 2015, 2016, those are the years that we had the impact of El Nino. So if you calculate very easily, exactly after 7 years, we have started experiencing. Now this El Nino is not part of climate change. El Nino is a natural phenomenon. Now, but this natural phenomenon can aggravate the problems of climate change.
Right.
For example, temperature. Now,
Understood.
in the normal scenario, there's warming. And here comes El Nino that have plus alpha on top of the increase in temperature. So people start feeling it drastically. People, animals, plants, everything, every living being start feeling it. And your question was whether we had any chance of knowing it earlier.
Yes.
Right? Yes, actually. Somewhere in March, the Department of Meteorology claimed that they have already reported, and of course the World Meteorological Organization of the United Nations also said that there's about 50 to 60% chance that there can be an El Nino this year. And this message, I mean, we were also communicating at different forums, but not as serious as we do it right now.
Right.
So it was on 4th July, the World Meteorology Organization, with almost very high certainty, 90% probability, they came out and categorically said that, yes, El Nino has started greeting us. So that's how people come to know about the impacts and so on. But of course, predictions were done even before that at different levels of probability. So the planning, if we got it seriously, planning would have been done to face this scenario. But whatever the things that we plan, that we have to be very careful with respect to predictions. Predictions are based on probability. Things can happen, may or may not.
But what was the probability like? I mean, on a balance of probabilities, as in courtrooms, that's what we consider at least.
Usually
on a balance of probabilities.
Yeah, see, 50. When you toss a coin, the probability is 50%, right?
Yes.
That you get.
Was
right.
this another situation of 50%?
No, actually, when it goes beyond 50%, maybe somewhere around 60%, which Department of Meteorology, as they informed to us, they have done it on May.
So they said in May that there is
Yeah.
a 60% chance that this dry season will be more intensive than the previous
more
years.
intense than the previous season. So that was the message that we had. And of course, by July 4th, as I told you, it's almost certain that El Nino is in.
So, but really the question is now, people are wondering as to if this is something, the nature's fury that we can't really plan for or prepare for, or we found out about this too late. Much like the tsunami disaster. It was too late when people found out what was really happening.
Yeah.
By that time, hundreds of thousands of people had lost their lives already. Or was this an issue of mismanagement of water? Because as Sri Lankans, we know more often than not, mismanagement is quite rampant in the country, especially when it comes to public resources. And then water being one of the primary resources for people also. We haven't quite experienced a situation like this, at least in the near past of Sri Lanka. But now we are experiencing this right on the head of having experienced a shortage in fertilizer. But then that again was completely the inept decision that were taken by the authorities. But in this situation, do you think there was a management issue? Could this have been managed not better? I know any situation can be managed better. That's kind of a broad statement to make. But was this situation mismanaged?
This is the way it happens. Let me take paddy as an example. When paddy cultivation takes place, and also let me take few examples from different areas, otherwise it will be difficult to talk about and spoke of the whole scenario in the country. If you take the major irrigation schemes, as we know, one mine irrigation schemes, there are farmer organizations. And with the participation of farmer organizations and under the chairmanship of the district secretary, the government agent, for example, and getting all parties involved in, there are pre-season cultivation meetings. At that pre-season cultivation meetings, that means before the yellow season starts, before people start doing land preparation, they plan it very well at the meeting, saying that, on what day, on which week that they are going to clean the bunds and then prepare the land, broadcast or transplant paddy, which variety, and what are the management practices to be done. And at that particular meeting, the irrigation department, when the major irrigations are in, and Mahaveli Authority, when the Mahaveli scheme get involved in, and the Department of Agrarian Development, who manages the mine irrigation schemes. Now, all those together decide when the water issues will be done. And when the water reservoirs are not filled adequately, and when there's a fear or an alert that there will not be any adequate rainfall, always the government departments will advise the farming community saying that, okay, you need not go into a full-scale paddy cultivation, which requires a lot of water, the way that we cultivate, and they can think of looking at other field crops which require less water compared to paddy. Now, those type of advices are given, especially in yellow season. We are in the yellow season right now.
Right.
But you know, the normal scenario is, because rice is not only agriculture, rice is part of our culture, isn't it? So whenever the time there's heavy rainfall that farmers experience, the natural tendency is that whatever the advice you get, you move into paddy cultivation. Now that is why even initial stages, the Ministry of Agriculture was proudly saying, this year we have started cultivating more than 500,000 hectares of paddy in the yellow season alone. The usual scenario is about 430 to 450,000 hectares maximum. But then here comes a scenario that we had a higher cultivated extent.
So, but then wasn't the ministry really aware that this time the drought is going to be worse, and actually cultivating over 500,000 acres of paddy is not really something to pout about, but something to be concerned about, because despite you cultivating that, you're not going to reap any harvest.
You hit the jackpot here, right? I must tell you, it's not a secret to say that farmers have cultivated more than 500,000 hectares. And that itself gives an indication that they will require irrigation water for that, especially during a season like Yala. Yala season, where rainfall is generally lower than that of Maha season. And once again, especially in the dry zone areas where agriculture takes place in a highly intensified manner.
Right.
So in such situation, the planning would have done better in order to make sure irrigation water is released, because if you cultivate in a forest area after encroachment, anybody can say that, okay, we did not know it. But here is a situation, paddy fields, you cannot cultivate in secret. You know, the paddy fields are cultivated, and that's why the Department of Agriculture, Minister of Agriculture was also very proud that we are going to produce more. But in such a situation, the planning would have taken place in a much better way, while knowing that when the farmers have started cultivation, I mean, the general scenario is you will know exactly in what duration the farmers will be harvesting paddy, or at what given particular time of the growth stages of the crop that it will require water. Now, this is where the issue was. Now, one thing we have to understand, there are a lot of agencies in Sri Lanka that manages irrigation water.
Okay.
Remember what I told you? Mahaweli Authority manages the Mahaweli scheme, which is the largest scheme. But that water is not only for agriculture, it's for electricity generation as well. Then comes the Department of Irrigation, which totally looks at irrigation and human and animal consumption, but not electricity generation. And mine irrigation schemes are generally, once again, for human consumption and agriculture. But we should not forget, there are certain reservoirs that are managed by the Ceylon Electricity Board, because they are basically, and the overall idea of establishing them is to generate hydroelectricity. Now, what happened in the southern province, Udawala area, with Samanala scheme coming into picture, was something like that. Samanala was built up, the scheme was built up for electricity generation. But we learned later, there had been an agreement that in case where people in the downstream, when they do not have irrigation water to cultivate or do agriculture, Samanala scheme, despite the fact that it is for electricity generation, they will provide irrigation water.
So the priority at a do or die situation would be to provide water.
And I must tell you this, I have not seen any document of that nature, but it was clearly said by the Parliament. So we take it for granted at that time, assuming that whatever spoken or explained at that situation is absolute. So that's the way we have to move forward. Otherwise, it's going to be a very difficult scenario, isn't it? Right. So I mean, that's where the issue was. So what I see as a person looking from outside, being in Sri Lanka though, and knowing the subject a little bit, I must tell you, but then still, the important part is there have been somewhere an issue with respect to communication. I'm not saying miscommunication, but probably no communication. Because
that's worse.
But miscommunication is much more dangerous, like misinformation. Misinformation is much dangerous than no information, right? So you have to understand that part.
But that's a very thin line that you're walking on.
It's very difficult, I must tell you, right? But when you come to such a scenario, now when Electricity Board, for example, they are mandated to look after the electricity supply to the country. And they are not very much worried about agriculture, because something goes wrong with the electricity system, then who are to be blamed? Ceylon Electricity Board, not the Department of Agriculture or the Ministry of Agriculture. If something goes wrong with agriculture, not the Irrigation Department or the CEB get the blame. It's the Department of Agriculture and Ministry of Agriculture. So naturally, natural tendency is that, I'm not saying it is good, but natural tendency is say you try to look after your mandate and you work within the framework. But I think we have to go beyond that. That's the point that I'm trying to make. You use the correct word. We have learned a bitter lesson at the very beginning when you gave the introductory part. And the bitter lesson that we have learned is at a high cost as well. Usually this happens very unfortunately. Every time we learn lesson at a massive cost. But what we have to make sure is that we should not repeat it happening. That's an important part. So even today morning, there was a very important meeting summoned by the Secretary to the Ministry of Agriculture, where all agencies involved in agriculture were summoned together, including universities. I all had the privilege of taking part in that, to plan for Maha season, considering the current and the future predicted scenarios with respect to climate. That's a very good move, I must tell you. I mean, finally, what I came to know is everybody was speaking the same language. Everybody is concerned, and their solutions are more or less overlapping. So in such a beautiful line of thinking, why don't we work together? Why don't we get together? And that's the most important part that we learn, everyone, because the line of thinking is the same. Everybody starts saying that people should start cultivating on time, which has been, I mean, propagated. The message has been taken across, I mean, many years back. But unfortunately, when you try to implement, that implementation part does not take place effectively. You know, Sri Lanka, when you look at the country's policy-making history, for example, we are very good. We are very good policymakers. I mean, we have done beautifully in terms of policy-making, but when it comes to implementation, in most of the cases, we have failed miserably. So I think the lessons are learned in a hard way, probably will direct us toward taking the correct decisions in the future.
Definitely, Professor. And the matter that you mentioned of all stakeholders coming together and having a fruitful discussion, I think, at least during the recent past, there was not too much room for discussion. It was arbitrary decisions that ended up being inept decisions that ended up destroying the country, bringing it to where it is today. But again, like Professor said, learning from our mistakes is important. We'll cross over to a short commercial break and meet you with more on the other side. Stay tuned. You're watching Newsline Live.
News First, Newsline.
Indian Defence Minister to visit Sri Lanka over the weekend. Request to delay the visit of the Chinese research vessel. Domestic debt optimization program will not be changed, says State Minister of Finance. Lawyers launch joint program to protect the rule of law. Interim compensation for Express Pearl disaster. Leave aside meaningless statements and political drama and solve the issues of the people, says the Catholic Bishop Conference. Asia Cup to begin tomorrow. Sri Lanka contingent named.
News First, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline Live. We're in discussion with Professor Buddhi Marambe. Professor, you were talking to us about the mismanagement that has led to the crisis in the agricultural sector with no water. Professor, we have only a few minutes left in the show, so let's try to wrap our heads around this next issue, which is the agricultural framework in Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is not the only country that is big on agriculture. Actually, we were once known as the granary of the West. I beg your pardon, of the East. And that was our might in agriculture. But today, we are nothing but a speck of dust as far as the agricultural technologies in the world go. Dubai, being a desert, they are cultivating much better. They have much more advanced agricultural techniques than we do. Israel, being a country always constantly in conflict, they have much more advanced agricultural technology. While Sri Lanka, that was called the granary of the East, are now struggling to cultivate the paddy fields that they've cultivated for generations. Professor, so speaking on this agricultural framework and our agricultural technology, why do you think that we have not pushed forward on the heritage that we had? I mean, we are all proud of 2,000 years of history, but what have we done with that history?
History is to be proud, as you quite correctly said, but we better not start living in it. Because the world changes, the technology changes. Take, for example, again, let's take the paddy example. In 1940, we did not cultivate any new improved varieties as we cultivate right now. We cultivated traditional varieties. We did not use fertilizer or pesticides. It was all traditional technology which we are proud of still, even right now. But remember, our average yield per hectare was only about 650 kilograms, according to the data available. 8 years later, in 2020, forget about 2021 and 2022 because of very rational decision that was taken. In 2020, our population was about 22 million. In 1940, it was about 6 million. In 1940, with 6 million and the yields that I explained a little while ago.
650,000 per hectare.
650 kilograms per hectare.
Sorry, 650 kilograms, yes.
per hectare. We had to import about 60% of our rice requirement just to feed 6 million people. In 2020, as I told you, 8 years later, we had about 22 million roughly. And we were producing much more than we can consume. Our average yield shot up to more than 4,500 kilograms per hectare. Why? Because of the technology. Technology that we develop on our own is mainly the seeds, the varieties that we develop in Sri Lanka through the normal breeding programs. More importantly, the farmers embraced that. They adopted it. Today, more than 98% of the cultivated extent in paddy fields in Sri Lanka are cultivated to these high-yielding varieties. So it's not to say that we have kicked out technology or we have not developed or let the technology evolve. We have done that, but not up to the level that we expect. Sri Lanka has always been late adopters, I must tell you. You know, I also came to know very recently, the first four-wheel tractor was brought to Sri Lanka in 1919. Quite a long time ago, more than 100 years ago. But it was not being put into use for productive use. And the second model, I don't want to mention the brand name, right? Second model of tractor, four-wheel tractor landed in Sri Lanka somewhere in 1952, 1953. People did not want to use it. And people were going against such technologies, saying that our laborers, our people will start losing their jobs, employment, if you try to mechanize agriculture. And that was a type of messages that blew across the nation at that time. But nowadays, go and look at what's happening nowadays. At least 90% of the paddy fields, they are mechanized at the head end or the tail end. Head end means at the time of land preparation. At least they use a two-wheel tractor. And look at the number of combine harvesters used in paddy fields to harvest paddy. That's at the tail end. So we were late adopters. I agree with you on one hand, where the other countries were moving very fast in their production technologies, innovations and so on. We were lagging behind, but we were very successful in breeding. Thanks to the rice breeders at the Department of Agriculture, I mean, we would have never consumed a variety like Kiri Samba. You know about it, right? It's in the scientific terms, it's called BG 360. That's the varietal name. And I mean, that type of a variety, that type of a quality characteristic, paddy or rice, I mean, I don't think we have ever met without proper breeding program, without science being put into practice. I just took only one example to let you know how things have evolved in Sri Lanka. But just because paddy got this advantage, not to say that every other crop had the same benefit. The focus was different. But again, we are talking about hybrids. I'm sure you have heard about hybrids. Hybrids are the F1 generation, the first generation of parents. Now, when there's a vigor in that hybrid, first generation, they try to use it for cultivation. But the only problem is every time you have to develop or build up the first generation in order to make sure farmers will get better seeds to cultivate. Right? So that's the technique that people use.
So, Professor, there has been development in the agricultural sector in Sri Lanka. Implementation, adaptation has been lagging. Adopting these new techniques has been lagging. And of course, as we discussed before the commercial break, there is lack of communication between all stakeholders.
That's one of the biggest problems, I must tell you.
Definitely, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor Buddhi Marambe, for joining us on our program today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on Newsline for tonight. Thank you very much for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.
මන්ද පෝෂණය කියන දේ අපේ රටට බලපාලා තියෙනවද?
මන්ද පෝෂණය රටට බලපාලා තියෙනවා. මේක පිළිබඳ දත්තක් තියෙනවා.
කාට හරි හිතෙන්න පුළුවන් මගේ හැම කැතයි මට ඕනේ සුදු පාට හැමක් කියලා.
අපි දේක ප්‍රතිඵලය විතරක් නොබලා එහි ආරක්ෂිත බව ගැනත් හිතන්න. එතටම අපි කියන්නේ ලස්සනට ඉන්න එපා කියලා. අපි කියන්නේ